Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again with Matt Kelly for another episode of the award-winning Compliance Into the Weeds. Welcome back, Matt.
Hello, Tom. Good to be here.
Matt, we had one of the either most fun, most delicious, most crazy, or throwback FCPA enforcement actions we've had in quite some time last week involving an American institution, John Deere. You've blogged about it. You want to set the stage for us?
Sure. So I think this case might be all of the above oddball adjectives you just threw out there, Tom. This was a case from the Securities and Exchange Commission, which had a $10 million civil penalty or civil settlement with John Deere for bribery that happened in the Thailand office of a subsidiary that Deere acquired at the end of 2017, which that subsidiary, known as the Wirtgen Group, so this would be the Wirtgen Thailand office, they just committed bribery there. They did it from 2017 clear into 2020. And John Deere apparently did not integrate the Wirtgen Group's operations into John Deere's parent compliance program quickly enough. The SEC had faulted John Deere for that. But more than anything else, the accusations here in the SEC settlement order really read like every sort of FCPA opinion statement you might have seen in the last 15 years, all rolled into one. The accusations are that the Wirtgen Thailand people took government officials to massage parlors there. They took some of the Thailand government officials on a factory visit to allegedly Germany, Wirtgen's parent company headquarters, except they landed in Lausanne, Switzerland, and then spent the next week there on a luxury sightseeing tour. There was, of course, the always present sketchy third-party agent who was paid through offshore accounts. And then the Thailand Wirtgen people masked all of this by falsifying documents. Nothing we haven't heard before, although I don't know that I've heard all of that in one case before. So we could focus on the salacious details like the luxury trips and the massage parlors, although there is that bigger question of why did John Deere take too long to integrate Wirtgen into its compliance program? As I mentioned, the SEC expressly called out that as the big deficiency they wanted other companies to pay attention to. Ultimately, this led to $5.4 million in disgorgement and penalties, or disgorgement in interest, plus a $4.5 million civil penalty for $9.9 million that Deere had to pay out in total. And here we are.
Matt, certainly the failure to integrate, and I'm going to throw in the failure to do a forensic FCPA investigation or analysis after closing, are critical, but there were additional red flags, as clear red flags as you could have, but also internal control violations that the SEC noted. You want to maybe highlight those for us?
There were all sorts of things here. Let me see if I can just find some of the points. It is worth noting that the Wirtgen Group did actually, prior to its acquisition by John Deere, they did have a code of business conduct, and it forbade employees from giving, quote, absolutely anything to influence a government official. They just ignored that. And so they would submit expense reports, as you said, with red flags written all over them. For example, the expenses would be in nice round numbers. I don't know about you, Tom, but whenever I take anybody out, I very rarely come out to a bill of $100 or $500 or $1,000 or something like that. It's always an odd specific amount that you tend to rack up. That was not present here in the expense reports. These were just nice rounded numbers. They didn't include any detail about what were these expenses for. Occasionally, they would submit expense reports and had it padded out with additional Wirtgen Thailand employees who supposedly were present to make these expenses seem a bit more reasonable when in fact those people were not present. And then all of these expense reports were simply rubber stamped by the managing director for Southeast Asia, the managing director for Thailand, the people who should have known better because they're only one or two steps removed from Wirtgen's parent company back in Germany, or the parent offices, where, as we said, they did have some semblance of a code of conduct and it did have enough sense in it to say, don't do this, but they just went ahead and did it. And the expense reports were fairly obvious that this looked kind of fishy. And then, I mean, just to go on and on about visits to the massage parlor. One can only imagine what goes on in those places. Visit to the factory site in Germany, except the expenses match up to hotels in Switzerland. And they were bringing along spouses of government officials. Easy FCPA 101 sort of stuff you would have expected to see in an enforcement action in like 2009. And this was happening clear into 2020. It just really, you're astonished that a large, sophisticated company like John Deere, $37 billion in annual sales. This is not a small company. And they acquired Wirtgen for $5 billion with 8,200 employees, not a small acquisition. You would have thought that they would be able to catch and smooth out all of these corruption concerns early, and none of that happened.
Man, I didn't see any evidence or commentary in the order itself that Deere or Wirtgen self-disclosed. So I'm going to have to assume they didn't. But I also didn't see anything in there about pre-acquisition due diligence, pre-acquisition review from the compliance perspective. Was that something you saw, or is that kind of information lacking as well?
Oh, no, I didn't see it in there either. It was one of my great questions as I was looking at this settlement order from the SEC, also begging the question, will we see something from the Justice Department on the criminal side? Unclear. I have not seen any sort of declination letter from DOJ yet. But as of right now, we only have this civil enforcement from the SEC. But I did spend a lot of time thinking about how would you miss that? As I said, this was a large acquisition for John Deere, $5.1 billion that they paid. 8,200 employees in more than 100 countries around the world. So clearly, at least some of those Wirtgarten employees had to have been in high-risk markets, including a place like Thailand. Thought a bit about one thing we don't know is specifically how much revenue came from Wirtgen, Thailand. It may well be not much. And it may well be that a large organization like Deere hadn't yet gotten around to looking at Thailand, or maybe when they did pre-acquisition due diligence, they weren't looking at every single one of those 100 national markets that Wirtgen was in. Okay, I am open to the idea that a large company isn't going to catch every single bribery risk in the acquisition, especially if it's a larger acquisition. But in that case, what could a compliance team start with in pre-acquisition to be able to at least get a sense of what might our risks be? Would you want to assess the efficacy of the target's compliance program? As we said, they at least were aware, Wirtgen, that they should have a code of business conduct. They had one. Did they have any ability to look at expenses? Did they have a strong internal audit function or a strong accounting function with a lot of visibility? Maybe that would have surfaced these clearly questionable expense reports out of Thailand. I also wonder, what about the other 99 countries where Wirtgen was operating? But if you can't catch everything pre-acquisition, what would be the place where you invest your time as a compliance function to be able to catch messes and clean them up quickly after the deal close? Looking at the strength of the target's compliance program would clearly be the place to start. We don't have any detail in the settlement order about what actually did or didn't happen there, other than they didn't integrate Wirtgen into John Deere's larger compliance program in a timely fashion. That's pretty much all the SEC says. We don't even know what was that larger compliance program John Deere had at the time. They've taken some remedial steps since then. We can get to those, but we just don't see much about what was going on from 2017 into 2020.
Man, I just quickly pulled up the 2023, 2023 Transparency International Corruption Perception Index in Thailand is listed in the bottom third, coming in at a robust score of 35. I don't think there's any surprise that it at least is potentially high risk. The lack of pre-acquisition due diligence coupled with the failure to integrate the acquired company into John Deere's compliance program and perform any additional forensic FCPA analysis or other review are certainly lessons to be learned. But the SEC also called out Deere for some positive steps they took. And you noted that in your blog post. Perhaps we could explore some of those to see how you perhaps can start to make a comeback, even if you don't self-disclose.
As always, there was right away discussion of how the individual offenders at Wirtgen were treated. They were fired. Good, step in the right direction. They talk about launching significant improvements, quote unquote, to Deere's internal audit and compliance programs. Okay, that makes me wonder, as I just mentioned, what was the strength of the compliance program and the internal audit program at Deere, not at Wirtgarten, at Deere? What was the strength of those two functions before all of this came to light? They did cooperate extensively with the SEC. So document translation, producing overseas witnesses, sharing a forensic accounting analysis, overall improvements to Deere's compliance program. So that's better anti-corruption risk assessments, better internal accounting controls for third-party management. They also, and I love this, Tom, near and dear to both of our hearts, is that Deere launched an in-house compliance podcast. I have not found an episode of this online yet. If anybody knows where one is or could point me to it, I would love to have a listen to it. And they did launch a company-wide bi-monthly compliance newsletter. Those are nice tone at the top gestures. And there's a whole lot of more specific stuff in here about improving the strength of the program. I am still just a bit puzzled that those steps had to be taken after all of this happened, because the bribery acts were happening clear into 2020. So the firing of the people, the improvements of the program, I'm guessing that didn't even start until 2020. What was going on with the strength of Deere's compliance and internal audit programs before 2020? These were not small companies, and yet still we had these struggles. It was not a mystery by the late 2010s that Thailand is a haven for bribery, that acquisitions are a prime source of compliance headaches. People knew what FCPA violations might look like and the importance of internal audit and compliance and documentation. And yet all of that came up short with Deere clear into the current decade we're in. These incidents with Wirtgen Thailand went on for more than 2 years after the acquisition of Wirtgen Group. How did all of that come to pass? I would have thought a large company would be more sophisticated and aggressive in integrating a target that large into its compliance program. And yet here we are.
I'm going to take credit for their starting, quote, a new podcast dedicated to the discussion of compliance issues, end quote, having been the only person that advocated that previously. So I'm going to harp on that. But there's one other line in the order I wanted to read to you, Matt, because I think it is of some significance, and I would like to point it out for the compliance professionals listening to that. And it's the last line of paragraph 44, which is the section on John Deere's remediation steps. And it says, quote, respondent has also undertaken an analysis of its compliance program and continues to make improvements utilizing anti-corruption risk assessments, internal audits, and enhance internal controls related to third-party management. Matt, I'm going to make this leap that when it says an analysis, that's a root cause analysis. And that's something we're beginning to see a little bit more and more from both the DOJ and the SEC, that before you get to your risk assessment and your program improvements, you need to do a root cause analysis. And if that intellectual leap is correct, I'd like to call out Deere for that, doing that. Number one, as a kudos, and two, for compliance professionals, think about that in the context of any problems you might have.
I mean, I think that is good to call out. And I would certainly advocate that a strong root cause analysis capability, whether the compliance team does it or you borrow that service from internal audit or somebody else, that's going to be crucial to having a good compliance program. Nonetheless, I am still kind of struck by, so what was the root cause here? Because really the root cause was that Wirtgen didn't get integrated into the compliance program for more than 2 years. I mean, literally, they failed to get with the program. And was that because the compliance team was under-resourced? Is that because The Wirtgen subsidiary was still exerting a lot of autonomy. Was the board of John Deere invested in finding out the culture of compliance throughout the firm? We don't know any of that. It seems to me that the way they called out the failure to integrate, that's a different sort of root cause than we had crappy accounting systems that didn't give us transparency into the expense reports. Now, that's still a root cause of corruption, and we're going to see that for a long time. If you don't have investment at the top to say, we need to get everybody on the same page with our culture of compliance and do it double quick, if you, that's a different sort of fault, and it is larger than just having poor accounting and transparency into your financial transactions. I'm glad that root cause is being discussed here, but on the other hand, like I said, I would love to know what the root cause was of not integrating such a large acquisition for more than 2 years.
So I guess I read the root cause of this as a little more towards the internal failure of internal controls and accounting systems. And I thought the SEC just called out the failure of Deere to integrate and or investigate and then remediate for another reason. But I just want to once again emphasize that's a big part of it. I guess, Matt, I kind of like to end with not so much that everything new is old again or everything old is new again, but that there are some pretty good lessons from enforcement actions in the first decade of this century and the second decade of this century. And you need to follow some of the basic rules.
That is true. Yes. And look, I mean, like I said, I read through these offenses and just like, how on earth are we still making these mistakes that I can remember escorting government officials on trips and whether that would be bribery or not. Like, there were FCPA opinion releases about that, I would say at least 10, if not 15 years ago. I thought that was all pretty clear about what is or isn't permissible. And by the way, these trips, if I remember right, for the four government officials and two spouses was in excess of $40,000 for a week. That's an expensive trip. I mean, did nobody anywhere think to ask for more documentation about that? It's just, it's striking that still today, in what is, I guess, now our third decade of this century, we're still making these same elementary mistakes sometimes. They still crop up.
Let me put a little specificity around that. In 2007, the Department of Justice had two opinion releases around number one, gifts, travel, and entertainment, and number two, business expenses, where they laid out every one of those things. So it's 17 years. These are not hidden gems that you can't find. These are well-known requirements under any best practice compliance program.
Indeed.
Matt, I would say it's amazing that every week we get something insane to talk about, but this is one of the more fun ones.
Uh, that I agree with. I look forward to the next massage parlor FCPA case whenever that might come along.